Welcome to Ideas of India, where we examine the academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Kotasthane at George Mason University. Today my guests are Pranay Kotasthane and Raghu Jaitley, the authors of the new book Missing in Action. Pranay is Deputy Director at the Takshashila Institution, where he teaches policy, geopolitics and public finance. His current area of research is semiconductor geopolitics. Pranay also co-hosts Puliyabazi, a popular Hindi podcast on policy and politics. Raghu is a political economy and public policy enthusiast, and he and Pranay also write Anticipating the Unintended, the excellent weekly newsletter on Indian public policy. We spoke about the intersection of markets, society, and the state, the difference between the state producing, provisioning, and financing goods, the importance of rhetoric, the conflation between misrule and alien rule in colonial India, why economic growth is not a major political demand, and the role of Bollywood in public policy education. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. Hi Pranay, hi Raghu. Welcome to the show. It's so good to finally have a chance to speak with you about your book.
Hamare aho bhagya.
Thank you. Mogambo khush hua.
In the very early part of the book, you talk about this clear distinction between different ideas or visions of the state, and you use the Buchanan-Musgrave distinction, right? And this is basically a very public choice sort of thinking. Do individuals fundamentally change when they exit the market and enter government? And therefore, we think of government as a favorable institution with good incentives, or we are suspicious about government and government failure in the Buchanan sense. And because we think that individuals have, good or perverse incentives even in government. But how do you guys think about this problem? And I wanted to start more fundamentally at the individual level. Do you also think of individuals as, depending on whether they enter market or politics, they fundamentally are the same or they fundamentally change? Or do you have like an even broader conception of individuals, sort of Thomas Sowell and the constrained versus unconstrained vision of man, as they say, but any individual? Like the entire book has an underlying public choice theme running through it, but I want to clarify this at the very beginning.
These are tough questions, so normally Pranay takes them.
So let me begin. I think our version of how we think about the individual is that individuals are same whether they are in the government or not, right? So yeah, from a very public choice point of view, individuals will respond to incentives, and of course the incentives in the government and incentives outside will be very different, right? So that I think is broadly similar to the public choice view. But one thing we try to be different about is we locate the individual at the center, at the centroid of this triangle where the state, the society and the market are the three vertices. And that's where we think all these three elements have a very different role for the individual. So the state provides the security, the sense of freedom governed by the law and order, etc., so that the individual can do whatever she wants, right? And similarly, the market provides the freedom to the individual to express themselves, right? And to do great things, to do different things, try out different things. And whereas the society finally is important element because it also provides this sense of belonging. And, you can call it a small nation, or a nation is the biggest group of the collective in that sense. But you will also have the smaller groups which provide that sense of belonging, the sense that you are bigger than the atomic self, right? So those are three elements, and we think that each of these three vertices have their strengths and have their weaknesses, but it's for the individual. All three have a critical role to play in any individual's life. And I think this idea has been explored in many other ways. So Raghuram Rajan talks about it in his book, Third Pillar, and Rohini Nilekani's book also talks about the Samaj Sarkar Bazaar. But we have looked at it from a element of, what is the relationship of all those three vertices with respect to each other, not just the individual as well. How does the state interact with the society, and how does the state also interact with the market? So that's how I would look at it.
Yeah, see, the core distinction between Buchanan and Musgrave was, like Buchanan put it, Musgrave trusts politicians and we don't. And in a way, I think Musgrave had that famous formulation that there is a triumvirate for the government to work on, right? That it should provide public goods that the private sector can't provide. It should, redistribute so that there is equity in the society and there is justice. And there was always this fear that, unbridled capitalism is something that needs control. And therefore, there is a role for the government. And Buchanan's view was, like Pranay just said, individuals are individuals. They respond to incentives. And therefore, you need to be careful about what powers you are giving them, because they will then accordingly, tilt the balance in their favor depending on what their incentives are, rather than what might be the larger sort of purpose for the government. So in that sense, this enlightened, idea of what the state can do is all good, but it might not really work. This is an ongoing debate. There is enough and more in the 20th century that we have seen where government do make a difference in the lives of individuals, which goes sometimes beyond just making sure that individual public choice sort of constructs are met, because they sometimes take a larger view. I think we tend to be somewhere, between, a Musgrave and a Hayek. There are places where government should be doing the right things. Our argument is that an individual is, constantly interfacing with the government, with the market, and with the society. The answers are somewhere within. But what we want people to do is just understand the first principles of what is happening here. A lot of our focus is also on making sure people understand implementation is very important, and how to go about implementing things by anticipating the unintended consequences well. And if all of this are done well, there is some kind of an harmony that one can seek to achieve for what we believe is the sort of welfare, yogakshem. So, it's not that we have an answer. Our book is, in some sense, our own desire to know the answers, move around, try to read more, try to connect the dots, try to find some way for ordinary. By ordinary, I mean someone who's not steeped in some of these conversations to be able to access this information, this knowledge, to the extent that we have understood it.
As you can imagine, I'm in agreement with almost everything that you say. The point of view is quite similar to the way I would approach a similar question. But the reason I was asking about the individual is, given your view of the individual, this has never been the view of the individual that pretty much anyone in the Indian state has ever had, even post-liberalization. Now, whether we're talking about East India Company, whether we're talking about the colonial government, whether we're talking about, post-colonial India, it is not clear to me that anyone ever had an explicit sense that the decision-making unit is the individual, and one needs to think or worry about the individual's incentives, right? So it's always the group of some sort. So sometimes the group is linguistic, sometimes the group is caste, sometimes it's religion, sometimes it's gender, right? And tribes, of course. And, largely it is also decision-making groups in the sense of these are manufacturers, like the blanket clause. The subgroup is these are manufacturers of steel products. That's it. Right. And beyond that, there's never much about what are the incentives of an individual firm or an entrepreneur or someone who's working. Even labor is mostly thought of from the group dynamics of unionization vis-a-vis the capitalist or something like that. So on the one hand, your critique is extremely important and it's holding a great mirror to what's happening in India today. But on the other hand, it's almost as if you are talking about the situation from the point of view of an individual where no government or society in India ever imagined it to be from the point of the individual.
I would say no, in the sense that at least from, the Constitution and Constituent Assembly debates better than I do, but in the sense that in the Constitution, still the unit imagined, at least normatively, is the core is the individual, right? So, yeah, there are other elements of looking at it as groups as well, but the core thing is that there is an individual, that we, the people, are making something. There is this individual who is creating something bigger, and hence fundamental rights, etc. So there was at least normatively that sense that we have to do something for the individual. But yeah, in practice, you can say that there are differences. I would say, yeah, we've deviated from where we started, but there is a sense of individualism, and not just in the Constitution, right? Even if you go in Indian philosophy, etc., there is a very strong sense of the person, the being, and the individual, right? So those strands are still there somewhere. Maybe government actions don't always reflect that.
one frame often people use is, this idea of individual liberty, etc., or Western Enlightenment concepts. And they do not necessarily should not be transplanted into India. We have a very different society. We have very different ethos and things of that kind. Some of these are loosely used words. What is ethos and what's the imagination of a society about itself? Philosophers have thought about it in different ways and forms. On the flip side, we often believe that, Western society is a very individualistic society, and we don't use that often in the most complimentary manner. There is a certain, pejorative sense to that expression. I think both are in some sense not accurate. Like Pranay just mentioned, we have a history of individualism as much as we are communitarian sort of a society. And so is the, whatever you might call as West. There is nothing in the history when you go through it which suggests that there was some kind of, historically and very individualistic society. I mean, everything that they have done in terms of progress, every single piece of art and every single piece of literature that has come out of this, including during the Enlightenment, is not because there are some individuals doing things. And the number of wars they have fought way more than us. There is just so much of a belief in ethnicity, in clans, in certain sense of identity, that you cannot say that they are an individual society, because if they would not have been killing each other so many times in so many different centuries. So, we should not carry that baggage. We should use the first principle that eventually there is an actor in that sense who acts, and the aggregation of these acts often tend to produce results which sometimes are emergent, which are not sometimes fully understood by people. And it's best for us to sort of examine things from that unit, see how the units come together. And there are frameworks that people have given us. And therefore, whenever I put something like this, I'm very aware that people will immediately say this is just transplanting of some Enlightenment value. I mean, that's not true. My sense is the reason why we don't use individual as a unit in our society, in public policy discussions, etc., has nothing to do with our history or something. It's just how over the last 70 years, the state has encroached too much. It has made people believe that the individual is not as important. And all of this can be reversed. There is nothing special about us. There is nothing different about our history, etc., for us to say that these are things that we should junk because we are different.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, for me, it wasn't so much about whether these societies are actually based on individual action. Of course they are. It is more that now I'm asking more as, all of us who are professionals who critique policy for a living, does it make sense to critique policy from a point of view that was never the basis of that policy to begin with? Is that why we always keep talking past each other, right? For rent control or price controls, right? You beautifully described how individuals are going to have incentives. They're going to act upon those incentives. And the emergent order that you get is going to be something very different from what they imagined. But what if what they imagined was never keeping the individual in mind in the first place? And so does any of this actually add up as a policy critique in the Indian context? That is sort of more my question. It is an existential question, as you can see, for all of us.
I was just thinking at one level, we also know that, we are struggling with this idea of India itself, right? That what is the bigger group that we are talking about? And there also there are many differences. And at the other extreme, we are also contending with this fact that individual is not the probably at least well thought of unit when we are thinking of government action. So where are we? It's really confusing. But I would say even in government action, we do think of individuals. It's not so much about that axis of individual and groups on government action, but I think it's our failure to understand what government action entails and involves and leads to, and these are all counterintuitive ideas, right? I mean, pretty much a lot of economic reasoning is counterintuitive, and it requires us to put in that effort to understand that. And I mean, given that our starting point itself was this idea that the constitution will bring a social revolution, that the governments will do great things, I think we've delegated that thinking to the government too much. And that's why we don't necessarily think in terms of, what are the unintended consequences of that. So I think that is the element, not so much the individual versus the group.
You raise an interesting point. Should we be critiquing something where the underlying basis of that entire edifice is completely different from what we want to be sort of talking about? And therefore, you are sort of course, talking past one another because, you don't have a common sort of a, premise on which you will base your argument on. Our limited point is, yaar, sab cricket खेलने ही आए थे. Now you want to play gilli danda there and you say that, boss, this is a good ground for playing gilli danda. But खेल लो, but you will not put runs on the board because you are playing gilli danda. It will be gilli danda. Sometimes it can be entertaining and you will get some results out of it, some pleasure. Some people will, but it won't be cricket. And then if we come back and tell you that, boss, that is a cricket turf and everybody is paid ticket to watch cricket and you are playing gilli danda, you can't argue ki, boss, you've started now playing gilli danda, please comment on this game as players who are playing gilli danda. I mean, some people would be willing to go out and continue sort of commenting on gilli danda, but our views are thoda pehle cricket khel lete. I mean, let's go back to cricket rather than playing this.
No, I think that's quite well put. The reason I ask also is, I struggle with this constantly. So I used to think that a lot of the policy problems in India are because they've missed the fundamental sort of Adam Smith insight, right? That depending on the institutions and the sort of social institutions, not just on paper institutions, you can either have self-interest aligned with social interest, or there can be situations where self-interest doesn't align with social interest, right? And my perception of Indian policy was always, they missed this insight. They didn't show up in class that day. And because they missed this insight, everything else goes downhill from there. But it's not like I see that outside the market either. It's not like I see the state respecting, collective action or group action when it comes to tribals conserving forests. Right? Or, local community groups trying to preserve a water resource or something like that. So it's not just that they don't believe private individual self-interest can be aligned with social interest in any context. I just used to think it's a failure in the market sense, that they didn't get it. That's why they went to socialism. But I keep thinking about this. I haven't come up with any answers. I thought, you guys are a good group to test this out with, because so many of the questions in the book and the lovely examples in the book, these things keep popping up.
Yeah, I think, one argument on this is, obviously there are lots of people and we should always, have that humility that everyone before us who has come in has read everything and therefore knew everything. Yet they didn't go out and do things that we believe should have been quite natural in terms of if they were to be thinking about it the way we are thinking about it. So, which brings me to the point that I often think that, often Indian state is just absolutely, atheist in nature. It has no theism. There is no belief in anything.
It just is.
Yeah, it just is. It just sort of, moves around depending on where something is working, and let's, go down that path, and then somebody else comes and, maros danda and asks you to go to a different path. You go there because there is something which is missing, which is an underlying coherence of what principles or philosophy you will possibly work on. There is some argument around that. There was coherence and certain degree of thing for about 10 years when everything was planned that way. After that started, going away, and everything else that replaced it is a bit of a motley mix of beliefs, ideas, or possibly no beliefs. It's better that, we start having some coherence around it. And that coherence can come by, the broader point that we make is we want to try to bring that coherence by addressing the demand side of the story, by talking to citizens and by telling them that this is how you should possibly demand coherence among your elected people or among the policymakers that make policies for you.
Yeah, no, and I think that is quite clear and very much appreciated. The book comes from a first principles point of view, trying to explain first principles of government, first principles of market, and then how one should navigate that either as a citizen or as an expert or a policymaker, whichever realm you enter into, which is some form of collective action, like this is the way you think about it. So I think that is crystal clear in the book. In terms of the examples, you start with, once again, the book is in 3 parts. You start with government or sarkar, and then you move on to markets or bazaar. And the one thread through the book is that the government is sort of overwhelming markets and overwhelming society. And if it sort of recedes from markets and society in a meaningful way, then markets would sort of do the job that they do quite well. We have good empirical evidence on this. Society can do its job quite well, given, better institutions and better state capacity. And then the government can actually do what it needs to do to execute. What is the way to think about government receding from these areas? The way I think about it is, you have to chip away at it one by one, step-by-step reforms, right? If government is in telecom, you slowly bring government out of telecom. Same thing with, something else like, capital controls, then that's the next thing that you target. But what is sort of the bigger picture view? Because you have taken a big picture view of the state. And how does the state expand or recede in that sense?
I was thinking of it in terms of the types of things governments do, right? So if you say produce, finance, regulate, if these are sort of the three major functions that governments do. I would say you have to do, first of all, very less of production by yourself, right? So that is the first core goal. Only public goods probably you need to produce, but all the other things you can either finance or regulate. And then think about, when there are positive externalities, you would finance the beneficiaries. And if there are negative externalities, you would probably then focus on just regulation, right? So I think that is the way I would think of it, because like this is one thing, right? In India, there is a perception that US, for example, is, some place where capital is run amok and there is no law and order. It's free for all everywhere. But we know that the US government's as a percentage of GDP is around 35, 36, almost 40% of the GDP, right? I mean, how can you say that the government is missing? Government is spending almost 30-45% of your GDP. So, and similarly, whereas that in India is a quarter, right? A quarter of GDP. So all across, from public finance, at least we know sort of over the last, after the World War II, at least, that states have increased their spending in the market overall, in the economy, as a percentage of GDP. And as countries become richer, the government role actually increases in terms of spending. But governments then do lesser things and do them well. And the things that they do are mostly related to regulating well and increasing regulatory state capacity rather than trying to do. And I think that is the fundamental thing that we still have to reconcile, right? So, I mean, 1,500 state-run companies are there in India. Like, why are we having that? I mean, why do we have a sandal soap factory run by a state government still? When Bangalore's public infrastructure is so poor, right? So just those elements are required, that we shift our focus from producing. I mean, by default, we should think government production is not the way to go about. I mean, we should be proving the otherwise, whereas our default still is, that governments are a starting point or a solution locus rather than the others, right? So I think that is the way I would think of it.
You have that very clean distinction. And you're basically saying that, in a developing country, you can have provisioning and financing, but you should definitely not enter production. Like no sandalwood, no modern bakery, no Lodi hotel.
No Hindustan Latex Limited.
Like all these things are out of the remit of government. Of course, we can find so many examples. I think all three of us have grown for some part of our lives. We've been in socialism. So, we've consumed these goods. We know how terrible these things are, and we have good experience with government-owned sort of PSUs. We may even have friends and family who worked at these institutions.
One of the great pleasures of watching Chitrahar in the late 80s was Hindustan Latex Limited used to have this incredible product called Niro.
It's a condom.
And all of a sudden, while you're watching, they decided that, listen, this is when most people in India are watching television. Let's put a, Niro ad. And to the 11-year-old me, I'm like, what is this about? And what is worse, whatever, to hoodwink people, or not hoodwink, to confuse people further, befuddle people further.
I think Nirod and Hindustan Latex is a great example of the conception of the state, because the way the Indian government thought about the problem is they said, we need population control. And now how do we get population control? We should start manufacturing condoms. Like, first of all, I think we need population control itself as a problematic goal. So that's a separate question altogether. But their solution to the problem was not economic growth, not other things. It was, we should have a few educational programs for people, and we should actually produce our own birth control. So there was something like this for women. There were actually birth control pills. Again, the ads used to come in the middle of Krishi Darshan and Chitrahar on the state channel. And then there is, of course, Hindustan Latex, which is actually showing condom ads in the middle of, basic primetime entertainment, and not condom ads which are talking about sexual pleasure of any sort. It's all condom ads in the sense of population control. So coming back to the question of PSU, so you were talking in the book, you have a lot of detail on how, when it comes to markets versus government, we know that the market is very, very good at producing, right, and allocating resources. And so the argument is the government shouldn't produce anything. We know the government is terrible at producing things. And the moment the government enters the market, then it's a special kind of player, which means the standard, market competition and contestability doesn't quite apply to the government institutions in the same way. We see this with public sector banks, for instance, right? And finally, there is no profit and loss constraint, right? I mean, these are government owned. They can endlessly be making losses. The taxpayer will pay for it. So the products tend to be quite poor in quality, and they usually tend to be monopolistic in nature. So that point is very well taken. On the question of provisioning and financing, this is where you have the comparison with the more developed countries, right? How the United States is spending about a third of GDP in terms of government spending, India is less than a quarter, and so on. Does that make sense in a standalone basis, or are there various other steps that need to be figured out before we can compare the size of government in terms of spending or regulation apple to apple? Because there are lots of individual stylized facts comparing the two.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Like, it's not as if we can compare them apple to apple. And I mean, you've written that paper on isomorphic mimicry and things to explain that in an excellent way. So, yeah, I mean, the idea to understand that is just to keep in mind, because we have this fear, right, that the state recedes. And if we have a society in which the markets are given a big role, that there will be no state, and that is what we are trying to counter. That no, it's not as if that the state just disappears and the state just gives away its responsibility to some people who will take away your money and run out, right? That's not the idea. In fact, the state invests more in regulatory architecture, in becoming better at state capacity, and that is something that we need to think of. And now we need to put more effort in strengthening that regulatory capacity, right? I'll just give an example, right, which is not related to the market, but you can think of at the intersection of the state and society. Now, take the example of Bihar, right? Now, we know that economic growth, etc., a lot of work needs to be done. We also know law and order is a constraint, a problem there. But we have something called the prohibition thing, which is going on there, right? So the state thinks it is the role of the government there to stop alcohol, and though it is leading to people dying on, regular basis. But forget that is happening, and government continues. But how do you enforce this, right? You need to have policing capacity. Now, literally, Bihar government has put many ads in the last 2 years, and it is hiring the additional police personnel to actually enforce just prohibition. Whereas we know law and order needs improvement in Bihar in so many other ways.
Yeah, kidnapping and assault and extortion is like a more fundamental problem than bootlegging, right?
Yeah, this idea that we are expending precious state capacity in something which is, first of all, shouldn't be in the domain of the state is itself that we need to think, right? So that's how we need to think of that law and order. How do we improve, right? The basic things about law and order, judiciary, etc. Why aren't we putting more strength and capacity in that element rather than getting the state to do everything else, right? So I think a broader theme also is in our common conversations. State capacity is thought to be as an infinite thing. There is no limit to it. So I guess that is something we again want to question, and through this book we are again bringing in examples just to make that point again.
Yeah, and so, I have a broader question on this that I've again been thinking about for a long time. Why do you think that Indians, as a people, we are willing to tolerate enormous amount of failure from the government, and at the slightest failure in the marketplace, and you can have fraud, you can have scams, you can have, some bad incentives leading to bad outcomes in the market, you can have pollution. But the slightest, problem in the market, the sense is we want to completely clamp down on it, right? So we have this very bizarre, almost schizophrenic relationship, right? Like so khoon maaf when it comes to the state. And if the market does something, then absolutely not. Where does that come from? Do you have a sense of this? Because it does go to the state capacity question. We're just willing to live with the government taking on more and more while delivering virtually nothing. So do you have any thoughts on this at all?
One view of this is we do not consider, and nor have we been taught in the civic class quite well, that in many ways the government should be accountable. The government gets funded by our money. We have very sort of good sense of when we are paying for something. If somebody takes us for a ride, which is how we look at the market failures, that, oh boss, we paid for it, you took us for a ride. We immediately jump on that. In fact, there are a lot of private market failures where individual money might not have been lost, but it might be government money. But there we think that the government money is our money. The 2G supposed scam is a good example of that.
Yes.
Arey, to hamara paisa le liya.
Yeah.
But when the government is profligate and corrupt, for some reason, it immediately doesn't register to a lot of people that that is your money. For some reason, it is some kind of a thing that, oh, these guys are playing some game at a very high level. There is some corruption there. And therefore, you can ask, what is the genesis for this particular, malady that we suffer from? I mean, there could be multiple, but one of the things is, it's an easy thing in India to blame everything on colonialism. But the idea that there is somebody sitting there who's in some sense an overlord, a Maibab, is there. And the Maibab might do the equivalent of the Hindi movie Jamindar of the 60s, where he will have the Nautch girls and he will have the son who's absolutely a wicked, cruel guy and all of that. But we have learned to live with that idea that that guy is there. Whatever benevolence he gives us is great. But heavens will fall if my neighbor, takes me for a ride. Then I will, fight tooth and nail with him or whoever else, is taking me for a ride. So this connection that all of these folks are accountable to us, they are using our money, that the sources of government funds, the way the government runs it, that we have actually given them the legitimate, authority to use power on, to use violence on us. And all of this is a fundamental, kind of a knowledge or a kind of things that have not been taught to us. And these are not very difficult concepts to teach, but it's not there. I mean, both Pranay and I, including you, and you went possibly abroad and studied, but we are all representatives of the best that Indian education system have to offer. There was not one course ever, all the way to B school program, where somebody told us that, okay, let's now teach you about how public financing is done. What are the fundamentals of public financing? So I can do Black-Scholes and explain, good M&A transactions or a ESOP valuation. But, I can't explain, public financing or public finances in the way that I should be able to explain, because either it's not taught and then nobody ever tells us to get interested in it. And I think that there is a fundamental dislocation there in public discourse.
Do you think it's because we are transitioning from, we used to be subjects and then we became citizens, but that's not a switch that you can flip.
It's difficult.
And that takes a certain amount of learning and learning by doing to get there. And we still think of ourselves largely as subjects in most contexts. And the citizen in us is still very, very, it's like an infant citizen, right? It pops up, not as easily and pops up only in times of extreme distress, so to speak, like emergency or something.
Just 2 lines before Pranay. You are absolutely right. When I say all of this, I'm not judging us. I'm not judging Indian people. I'm not separate from that. I'm part of that.
Yeah, of course.
I'm not judging them. This person is not like, famously Kotler said, customer is not a moron. She's your wife. I don't know why he used that gender, but let's keep that aside. I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, the citizen is not a moron. He's your father. I'm, in that sense, hopeful that this takes time. One needs to, continue to work at it. One needs to hope that the natural progress of knowledge, of information being available, of enlightenment, not enlightenment, but of citizenry getting more enlightened will make them, go down that path, because that's the obvious path if you have, you continue to raise levels of education, awareness, and so on and so forth. So I'm hopeful that we are maybe going down that path. Maybe the progress is glacial, but it will catch, steam. It will go faster as we go forward. That's the hope.
Yeah, I was just thinking of different frames of this. And there are so many ideas on this, no definite answer. But yeah, one stream of reasoning is this colonialism, and we suspect the market because of our colonial experience, right? And that leads to an inherent distrust of markets as the go-to mechanism for solution. But the question then is, why state versus society, right? If we think of those two as element, then why the state? Now, to that, I wonder if this is the case for most of the economies which came through this colonial experience. And then there was this, freedom movement where the people who fought for freedom eventually formed the state, the new state, right? So inherently they had the legitimacy, inherently they had the trust of the people. So the state then which began, and it's not just true about India, probably true of Bangladesh and Pakistan, etc. also, right? That the state starts with this high ground that it is the primary driver of any social change, and that makes people see the state in a different way as the primary troubleshooter to whatever happens in society. So the third element of that is this is something like Devesh Kapoor has written, right? I always recommend that as the first paper if anyone wants to study public policy. Why does the Indian state both fail and succeed, right? And in that, again, I mean, it discusses this idea that Arvind Subramaniam talks about the precocious democracy, right? So I think there is something to that as well, where we don't necessarily have this idea of public goods being the core element that the state should provide, right? I mean, the public goods provision is so poor, but it's okay for us. I mean, we still want the state to do 30 other things really seriously and now, but we've made our peace by providing our own substitutes for the public goods. For at least those who can afford have done that. So that is very different. And again, so our demands from the state are also for private gains or at max for some communitarian gains, but not for public goods which will help everyone else. So I think that is also an element where maybe with time it will change. Again, it's not particularistic about India. It's just part dependence of India and many other states. But yeah, we are at that point.
Yeah. I've been reading some of the literature and the ideas of the independence movement. And the very early part of the independence movement, the way I, again, always conceptualize this was, Dadabhai Naoroji and Gokhale and, that generation, they were really informed by Enlightenment principles, largely because a lot of their school teachers were English and Irish and Scottish. They got those values. And then the next generation, especially those who were exposed, to the LSE and the Fabians, they started thinking in a slightly different direction. And, I thought that was the distinction. Now, the more I think about it, I think there's a second fault line, which is when you think about the Dadabhai Naoroji generation, for them, there were two separate problems. The first is there is misrule, which is caused by terrible incentives, bad tax policy, and so on. And the second aspect of misrule is these are aliens and they are never quite going to settle in as Indians. They can never quite have the perspective, the bottom-up perspective that they need of an Indian to formulate good policy. And then at some point, these two are aligned with each other, right? They are aliens and that's why the incentives are perverse. But at some point, it just became they are aliens. And that's the problem. All the focus on the incentives are terrible. We need better incentives, which is not just about voting and selection, whether it's like provincial elections or something like that. We actually need reforming taxes. We actually need investment in public goods and services. That agitation just completely disappeared, I think, after, say, 1925 or so, right? When the Motilal Nehru Gokhale generation kind of goes away. And then it's only us versus them, right? So at this point, the narrative, I don't think anyone intended it that way, but the narrative is as long as we govern ourselves, we're fine, right? We don't need any other good incentives, any informed public policy, any good tax reform, nothing of that sort. So what's your opinion on this? I mean, of course, I'm making a very broad generalization. I'm trying to simplify the narrative, but do you think there's any merit to this?
This is an area of tremendous interest to me. And, there is a certain value in discussing this because we might not get anything, but this is a very nice sort of conversation topic. I read this book. I had a great professor, at a certain place where I studied, who insisted that we read Poverty and the Un-British Rule in India, which is the famous Naoroji book. And his point was, read it because, that's the other strand. He had written a book that, that the way you are running this is un-British. That was the term, that you wouldn't rule this way if you were ruling your own country. And that book is quite a good book because it sort of points out, in some sense, public policy and economic failure. And, not by casting them as aliens. There is some amount of that as well. But it's just that, you are just being greedy or there are wrong incentives, etc. And that his idea was that having the book going and representing one of those constituencies that, I will go and make this point. And I think that was a good strand. And that strand got lost because there was some amount of passion replaced with it. And, there is a certain element of Gandhi who comes in with a force of nature where he said that I can't possibly fight on both fronts. And maybe his ideas around some of these, reasons for our failures were very different. And therefore, he takes us all down the path of, this is alien fight. Once they quit, we'll be fine. And I think that's a very, very good point to consider. It's a point that I have, often thought of. Was there an alternative pathway there? Had somebody who would have equally possibly weighed in on both Ambedkar was possibly in that vein. But Ambedkar had even more odds to fight. The poor guy, how many things would he fight? I mean, he can't be writing papers on rupee devaluation and also about annihilation of caste. And there's only that much of mental bandwidth one guy can have. But the other interesting thing, Shruti, was I've been reading about this Pan-Africanism. Because one of the things to me was that, we are not alone. Others also got independence. Some people got independence 15, 20 years. The early 60s, all of these guys got their independence. And therefore, the question was, what is this Pan-African movement, this African socialism? Because were they also talking about the same thing? And it turns out that if you take Nyerere, you take Nkrumah, so Tanzania, Ghana. See, I studied in Hindi geography up to a certain level. So मेरे मुंह से Tanzania निकलता है.
But that's fine.
No, of course it is fine.
I'm sure the way we say Tanzania is also not exactly the right way, and they probably pronounce it differently and, so on.
100%. I think it is Tanzania because I realized, sorry, digression, this is becoming Amit Verma podcast, but the digression is this. All original Hindi terms for many of these countries is exactly, I realized much later, is exactly how these countries call themselves. So in Hindi, we read it as Rus.
Yes.
Russians call themselves as Rus. Egypt, we called Mishra. There is a Mishra thing. Turkey, we used to say Turkey and they call themselves Turkey, so on and so forth. So I'm hoping that Tanzania be here. But anyway, so whether it is Nyerere, whether it is, Nkrumah of Ghana, Keita, all these guys, they had a similar question. And their view was there is an African identity and this African identity needs to be protected. We had a tribal society. It understood things. We can go back to that, but going back to that is a pain because we can't go back and, make a leap backwards in terms of all the other civilization stuff that we've learned. So let's take socialism and also let's fight against these foreigners and let's work on both tracks. So actually, the initial set of these guys were in somewhat, I would say, argue Naroji mode. They had a point of view on both. A point of view on socialism and a point of view on the fact that these are aliens, we need to own our own destiny. So whether it is Senghor, Senegal, they all did that. But, there might be other reasons, but it was disaster because they fully didn't even appreciate this. And of course, the roots of democracy were not too deep and, they struggled. So I think this identity point that we took and fought and over-indexed on possibly helped us keep ourselves united rather than ride two different horses, which could have led to problems is one theory that I later have. So to just go back, after reading those, I said, maybe we chose this, maybe that was somewhat wrong, but look at the people who chose to ride two of those horses and they had disaster both ways. So I don't know. So that's really my do paisa.
And I was just thinking, also, it was not hating the aliens as much it was hating the alien rule, right? So there was a difference, right?
Yes, the alien rule,
in fact, a lot of Gandhi's magic was to say that you can't just hate the Britishers, right? There's a problem with British rule. So I guess to even contain that kind of identitarian contest was a big feat, right? And we became successful in that. But yeah, we couldn't bring in another strand. I guess there were just too many things to grapple with, and we managed some of them at least.
There's this lovely, not a paper, but some kind of a, pamphlet or something I read, which sort of showed the clear change in how the British policies around budgeting, public work, education changed in the 60s or 1860s. And obviously the obvious reason is the first war of independence because of they realized that, listen, we just need to be extractive, exploitative and keep them under our thumb. Trying anything else is all quite dangerous. So just, produce these bunch of clerks and who will support, etc. But that paper argues that was less of an issue. The bigger problem was opening up the Suez Canal, which reduced the time and therefore made India less permanent in the minds of those who came. And this guy, I forget where, actually compares how many, the English, the Scots came in before the opening of Suez Canal and married in India to Indian, women. And post the opening of the Suez Canal, you could start having the supply of flies, the wrong word, but you could have this, women coming over to India looking for a husband and all of that. And actually they started finding India more of a temporary place rather than the earlier set of people who were looking at it as a permanent, which goes back to a stationary bandit, roving bandit thing. That changed again the incentives on how they were looking at India, which I think is somewhat of an interesting point. I don't know whether it can be any way empirically proved or not, but there is some correlation around that.
No, there is. And actually, this goes back even before the opening of the Suez Canal. There's a debate, and I think this is there in the archives, that Cornwallis gets into. So, Cornwallis fought in the American War, right, before he came to India. And that loss was a very big loss for him personally. And it really informed how he thought of Indian policy. So actually, when he comes, I mean, of course, he's part of the company rule. He's not part of the crown rule by then, right? But as a representative of the company, one of the things that he doesn't want is, he says there will be no special privileges given to children of, those who are company managers or company public servants. Their children will not get special jobs within the company. He was also very much against company workers marrying local agents, or, sort of localizing and settling down, because in his mind, that was part of the reason that the American experience misfired so much, right? The British went there and they took all their, governance and state capacity and military knowledge and prowess, and then they settled down there, and then they became American, right? They weren't British anymore, and then they sort of turned again. So this actually goes back even farther, that we need to come here and not become one of these people, because then they might, enable some kind of backfiring against company or crown. And I found that quite interesting. Warren Hastings may have lots of flaws, and he does, but this was one area where he disagreed with Cornwallis, that, we need to be like the Mughals in some sense, right? You need to become part of the people that you're governing. And of course, there is racism in all of this. It's of a particular time period, so leaving all of that aside. But this is an important distinction between the two that you pointed out. And I'm sure the Suez Canal, this whole thing pops up again. In fact, there are the exodus of the Anglo-Indians and the, sort of the European Indians after World War II, and even during World War II. That's a big exodus. There were a lot of people who actually settled down in India and thought they would live as Indians.
If you just go down the wiki rabbit hole of many actors and actresses and things of that kind, you suddenly realize how many of them actually were either they were born in India or their parents were born in India, and all of them moved back in between 30s to 50s. For instance, Tom Stoppard.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
He was actually in Darjeeling. His mother was an English lady, and so on and so forth. Vivian Leigh. There are just so many of these very famous people who moved back.
So this question of identity is interesting. The other thing that's odd is the very early part of the freedom struggle, both in South Africa, where Gandhi was agitating in South Africa, and also, what was going on in India with the early part of the moderate Congress, as we like to call it. It was mostly about Indians should have the same rights and privileges as other British subjects, right? That we should not be Indian subjects of colonial rule. So, the initial agitation was for dominion status. It was never for self-rule. And then somewhere the self-rule kicks in. And not that I think there's anything, bad about that, or I'm against that in any way. It's just the focus became self-rule as opposed to good rule, which need not always align. I think that's the simpler point.
We can go on and on about this. The other reason for self-rule was the Irish self-rule movement. And then therefore Annie Besant and, the trauma that Ireland went through during the 1840s and 50s and their self-rule movement.
The other thing, you brought this up even now on the roving versus the stationary bandit. And there are discussions about that, in the book. And this is, of course, Olson's idea. Of course, you start with Pan Singh Tomar, and that's lovely, where, the bandits are in parliament. Here we have rebels. But more generally, Olson's point of the roving versus the stationary bandit in terms of a situation where you have multiple people vying for a particular kind of power. And that means that there is no single individual or single group of people who are able to actually quell all the competing interests warring for power. And the stationary bandit actually manages to do that. And in exchange, the stationary bandit must promise certain number of things, which includes, good rule or basic public services in exchange for taxation and so on. So that's the general idea. Now, in the book, you talk about how democracies are run by stationary bandits, right? And autocracies are run by roving bandits, because autocrats die and then who comes next? But nowadays we have autocracies a little bit more like, say, the Emirati kingdom, where it's like a family, where there's a very clear line of who comes next. Or you have autocracies like the Communist Party, which is almost the company, right? It just kind of goes on in perpetuity. It has no beginning, no end, no life, no rebirth. So sometimes I wonder if this is actually flipped on its head right? In certain instances where the roving bandit is the democratically elected MP who's there for a very short time, 4 or 5 years, can't get very much done, right? Has weak accountability depending on the kind of democracy you're in. And actually, sometimes the stationary bandit, which is, these city states which are ruled by, autocrats, are the stationary bandit because there is a residual claimant, which is a family or a party or a company. What do you think about that? Because sometimes the incentives do align in that sense.
I agree with what you say, Shruti, that in the sense that you have this situation where roving bandits are different from, the roles have been reversed. And, broadly, I don't think it is so simple that in democracy they were
of course
stationary bandits. In fact, within democracies you can have roving bandits and stationary bandits, right?
Roving and stationary.
It's more from that angle rather than being able to explain various regime types through this framework, right? So I actually agree with even in China, if you see, a lot of the authoritarian streak is also there with a clear mandate for economic development that flows from top to down. The local incentives align for that. It's not as if there's no politics. There's a lot of politics, but within the rubric of the party state, and that happens, and it has its benefits and a lot of costs as well. So this stationary versus roving bandit might not necessarily explain the difference between regime types, but it helps understand which kind of architecture works well within the democracy, right? And in which conditions you have roving bandits and how can you avoid being so just having more stake, right? If you look at it from a very utilitarian or very instrumental sense, if you just look at it, if there is more stake of the people in the way things are governed around them, then you have a stationary bandit kind of model, right? So for example, our current local government architecture, for example, is not about that, right? We don't know where our taxes go, and most of the local governments are governments which are dependent on grants from either the state or the union government. So effectively you are having a roving bandit, you're ending up with a roving bandit. You don't have a stationary bandit which has the stake in your day-to-day life. So I think that is where the value of that framework comes in today's context.
Yeah, and also I think, the autocrat, the existence of the autocrat already assumes that someone has enough capacity and authority to quell all the competing interests, right? Which is another way of saying there is a lot of state capacity, right? So that is another important difference between the roving and the stationary bandits. So normally sometimes we think, the autocratic government seems to be doing better. Not that I'm in favor of autocracies at all, but just, as a comparative static exercise, sometimes they end up getting these better outcomes. But it misses the point that sometimes the very fact that they're autocratic, they built up the state capacity. And then because of they are the residual claimant, they may choose to use that state capacity in a sensible way because they will hold the profits at the end of whatever the term is that they're thinking of. So that also ends up, playing into this sometimes. China, I think, is fascinating because they manage to do it at scale while decentralizing. I can understand how the reforms worked out at the village level. And then, they had the mayor as CEO kind of, that model where it worked very well. The incentives were well aligned that the political authority at the local level would actually invite business, grow business, encourage economic growth, grow the size of the pie, basically. But how they managed to do that, not with one mayor or 20 mayors, but across a country that size with the Communist Party controlling everything, it's just fascinating how they did it and they got away with it. And of course, that must have had like a very authoritarian streak that none of us would like politically. But yeah, they managed to get a very different version of this roving and stationary bandit, altogether.
Yeah, I think of it as a car with no brakes, right? So you can have the accelerator and drive it in a direction very fast, but there will not be brakes. So once the state has enough power, it can do things like zero COVID policies. And you just have to face those consequences as a citizen, right? Even when Ang's book is great on this. So
yes, fantastic book on this. Yeah. This also brings me to economic growth, which is another important theme in the book. So let me ask the more basic question. Why isn't economic growth like a popular demand in India? it's a very odd thing. And especially now that we know that growth has worked out well, right? I mean, most people living in India, they're now used to, whatever, 2000 or 2200 GDP per capita US dollars versus 200, which was sort of, their grandparents' generation, or at least my grandparents' generation. So it seems quite clear that economic growth has been a good thing. Is it that they just take it for granted that, we're just going to grow 5% a year, in perpetuity? We don't have to really think about it, worry about it, or do anything to keep it going? Is it something else? Because I feel like it's almost part of the government lip service now, the way Garibi Hatao used to be in the 70s. This is what every government is supposed to come and say. They're supposed to say, we want economic growth. But is there any serious buy-in? Do people really care? If not, why not? What is going on in the Indian psyche? It seems so bizarre to me. As an economist, it's baffling that this is not a serious universal citizen demand, because they will get the benefits of it so clearly.
Yeah, I'll try to answer that. I think, first of all, I mean, if we'll compare it with, say, 60s, 70s, 80s, there is a difference, right? I mean, at least even if the state agents, like the governments, are paying lip service to it, the fact that they are regurgitating that economic growth is important is itself a change. It indicates that there is a focus on that, right? But I think the angle to this is that it's not that people don't realize economic growth is important, but always we find a new thing which we equate with giving the same importance to economic growth, right? So, for example, we will think of, inequality is something which is being talked about in the US or in UK. So because we are now in a globally connected ecosystem, right? And our ideas are flowing. So I think it's a result of isomorphic mimicry, Shruti, which you have written about more than anything else, that we want to be in this ecosystem of ideas. We want to be there where the world is, whereas our challenges might be different, but we derive our strength and our challenges from elsewhere. Why should we prioritize economic growth when there is inequality? Those discussions confuse this idea that, economic growth is still required, that most global inequality is still across countries, not within them, and things like that, So that's where I would put it.
I agree with you on the policy community. But for instance, Indian voters will punish governments for inflation, right? That is crystal clear to them. So onion prices go up, or, your basic, bundle of consumer goods, the prices go up, voters will punish. We used to call that anti-incumbency. It was just fiscal profligacy, which turned into anti-incumbency of some sort. Once we started getting that, under check, you started even getting state governments that go on for a long time. We don't see any kind of punishment from citizens in terms of whether there is alignment over economic growth or not. So is it that inflation so obviously affects them, it affects their day-to-day expenditure, but we've not managed to make economic growth in India inclusive enough that everyone's affected by it, that everyone actually feels the pinch when you don't have high levels of growth. So, that could be one possibility. The second could be it's simply that, their sort of fortunes, they don't link with overall economic growth of the country. They think of it as something they did themselves. I must have worked really hard at work, so I'm doing much better. Or my family has sacrificed a lot, so we are doing much better. But it actually has very little to do with what's happening more broadly in the economy of the country. So these are the two thoughts I have on why economic growth is not as salient, or lack of economic growth is not as salient as, say, something like inflation. But citizens tend to demand things. They're demanding clean water. They're demanding all these welfare transfers, but they're not demanding economic growth, which is very strange given sort of just the impact it has had on day-to-day lives.
I mean, this is a conundrum. And one of the things, and I'll possibly go down the proverbial path of saying that I speak to a lot of taxi drivers and, other people, and that's where I glean my, insights from. But it is truth that one of the things that I often do, this is not the taxi driver conversation, is that anybody who comes back from outside of India, and especially if they have gone the first time, and this includes a lot of my, first generation cousins, and generation cousins in the sense first generation, travelers abroad who happen to be my uncles and my cousins. I asked this question, that you went and saw what happened there, how those countries are. Why aren't we like this? And one of the sort of conclusions I've drawn is economic growth is important for us, but it often morphs politically into what is stopping economic growth. And this diagnosis of this problem politically is of the kind that allows political parties to let the electorate debate, kill each other, over what is the reason why we are not growing. Vis-a-vis talk about the things that will actually unleash growth. And the usual thing, and this is the easier thing to do, right? If you work in a corporate, this is a classic thing on how to, distract. The classic, electorate distraction is in India typically has been threefold. One, for a particular period of time, it was that, we need to bring equality. There are just too many people who are rich and, the kings and everything. And we just need to bring, garibi hatao kind of thing where we need to, sort of socialism will lead to everybody's growth. So wrong diagnosis of problem. And, every election was fought on the basis that there are these Seths and Punjipatis and, the usual. We've made many movies out of this. Later, this diagnosis went down to, that there is a particular community that has always been benefiting. And therefore, we need to cut the pie in a manner that we get it for ourselves. So it's not that economic growth is not happening. Some other people are getting it and we are not getting it. And let's then, keep fighting for who should be getting it. And this happened the moment we started getting some economic, therefore the corresponding demand for, reservations, etc. happened only when we started seeing that there was some growth, that more number of engineering colleges were being opened, seats were there, and so on and so forth. Of late now, again, I see that at least in the last 10 years, and this is where the insight has come from multiple taxi drivers, their general thing is we have gone back to, at least in their minds, population is a problem. And which is a surrogate for saying that their particular community grows their population much faster than others. And therefore, we will have this particular problem, which plays nicely into the narrative. So, and this is very strong, especially in the northern belt, in the Hindi heartland as you speak. So, I don't think we are unique in a way that we don't care about economic growth. I think it's clear that everybody wants it, but it quickly sort of morphs itself into what is therefore stopping us. We have the smartest people. Microsoft का CEO Indian है, Google का CEO Indian है, World Bank का CEO Indian है. So why what is stopping us? Essentially, what is stopping us is, 20 years back it was something else, now it is something else. And then enormous amount of time and effort and public discourse and electoral fortunes are actually, destroyed on that particular plank rather than going back and solving. And that, in my mind, is a wonderful thing, wonderful gift that politicians have in India, because they can continue to keep doing this rather than focusing on the real issues. Because the real issues also, in a way one should appreciate, is the politician is worried that the benefit, especially when you are trying to solve for structural issues, which are immediately the concerns in India, the benefits of them might come much later. So had we done something of this kind much earlier, that was still okay. Structural issues, who wants to solve them, right? If you try and solve them, the benefits might be 10, 15 years later, the pain will be immediate. And that's another problem. Every passing year makes it worse.
I was coming to that same point, just the fact that in economic growth and what you need to do to get economic growth, there's a temporal difference between them, right? So that might not necessarily translate into votes per se. That is one. Whereas inflation, like you said, the effect will be felt then and there. By the way, we have 7-8% inflation over the last few months in India. I don't think that is going to change electoral things, but let's see how that goes. Anyways, and the last point in that was, like what Raghu was saying, broadly, if you think of a place where the state is powerful, then the causal stories that it can tell people will also be very different, So if you think of all of history or all of things is about causes, right? There are narratives about causes and those get internalized by people differently. Now, if the state is very powerful, then the causes it can tell people about different types of things, why certain things happen, certain things don't happen. That narrative also becomes very powerful, right? So if you think from the Indian state's perspective, they can always say that when growth doesn't happen, that reason is, unguided or unintended or due to you are the problem, not me. Whereas if there is a success,
there are too many of you.
Yeah. And if there's a success, it is because of me, right? And because those causal stories are powerful, just because the state itself is powerful, that stories travel and they travel far, then its path of economic growth gets derailed by many distractions. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's one thing where, if we could find a way by which the electoral success would depend on economic growth success, I think India will solve a bulk of its problems. China managed to do that to some extent, right? Because for the longest time, the Chinese narrative was that the deal that the Chinese people have made with this communist party is, as long as their material well-being increases, they're willing to put up with a lot of restrictions and follow the rule, right? And which is also why last year, when the zero COVID restrictions happened and there were people who were starving and they couldn't leave their house and, they couldn't meet their parents, elderly people were starving. Suddenly the narrative changed and they said, oh, maybe this could be the first crack in Communist Party rule, because the deal that the citizen/subject in China made was, you promised us we will never starve and we will materially do very well. So I'm not saying that's the kind of deal we need to make with our, government, though democratically elected. I think we're plenty authoritarian as is. But in some way, if there was a way to align the economic growth or success outcomes with political outcomes, I think you get a lot of rapid change, which is, I guess, also why, in large parts of the book, you guys are recommending a large degree of decentralization, fiscal federalism, right? You need hard budget constraints. You actually need local governments to be able to earn their money, earn their revenue, spend their money, and so on. So there are some of those hints in the book, but I think the larger conundrum we have to solve.
I think one of the things that I keep telling in my private conversations is, just keep bringing back the point, the fact that growth is a moral imperative. Just keep bringing back the point. So, isse kya hoga? Isse will we grow? Will we become a $10,000 economy? If it is not, then it's a faltu ka distraction. Why? Let's become a $10,000 economy, then start talking about many of these things. Till then, we have only one thing to do. I think that, if there is a mass sort of mobilization of that, someone like an Arnab, every day at 9 o'clock, if somebody just keeps screaming, ki isse ho jayega kya $10,000 economy per capita economy, maybe we'll get somewhere. Because otherwise, there are many people, very happy talking about everything else and then, forgetting about this particular imperative. So I think our thing is that growth as a moral imperative is the most important thing. All other niceties can wait, including, distribution, equality, and all of those, equity and all of those. Wo pehle pahunch jao wahan pe, then we'll see. And then we'll solve for those problems. I include environmentalism into that, which doesn't make me popular in many places, but I'm like, wo kar lenge, matlab, we should do something minimum, but let's not overdo that stuff. Let's get to a good place before we start talking about such issues.
It's funny on the environmentalism and many of these other things, I think the trade-off is almost a false trade-off, in the sense that even with environmentalism, as people get richer, they do care more about the environment and they're willing to part with more of their individual money or collective money as taxpayers to deal with environmental problems. So even there, you are more likely to fix environmental problems, climate change, everything with better state capacity and economic growth. Like, these are the two things. So the trade-off sometimes feels a little false to me, in one sense.
I know, I absolutely agree. I think the immediate response that I give is that actually poverty is the biggest, damage that environment takes because of everything that happens because of that. The moment you get richer, you will actually start caring more for environment. It might be better for environment as well.
Many times we think normally that the problems of a $64,000 per capita income country are, they also have problems. So our problems are okay, but qualitatively, I would rather have the problems of a $64,000 per capita income or even half that, rather than thinking of what you can do in this $2,500 per capita, right? Everything requires money. Environmentalism requires money. How will the government raise revenue when you have this kind of market? So I think that is one element that we have to again internalize. Problems of a country which is richer will be very different and less problematic than what we have now. Their problems won't go away, but they'll be of a different nature. And the second thing, what Shruti, you mentioned related to that, I think this idea of that Vixelian connection, right, which we study in public finance, is one way to think about aligning economic growth and political outcomes. If you think of a Venn diagram with 3 circles, if the more there's an overlap between those who decide, those who benefit, and those who pay, so then there will be alignment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And decentralization is one way to get the Vixelian connection, but there might be other mechanisms. But these 3 circles we need to think of and see how we can get them to overlap more than they are currently.
Yeah, actually, I think the one great damage, of course, socialism did in India is, it distorts markets. It completely shrinks the size of the pie. There is, all kinds of shortages. And we all know those arguments. They're made wonderfully in the book. But the other part is there is a very high degree of centralization. And what that ends up doing is it completely breaks the link in India between the taxpayer and the citizen. right? So we're all citizens and we're all taxpayers, but the same citizen is not the same taxpayer for the same services, right? In fact, in India, we have very regressive tax system because it's so much based on consumption, right? If your GST is one of the largest pools of taxes as opposed to, income tax or property tax, then the poor guy who is begging in the corner of the street is paying 18% GST on a Parle G biscuit. And it's regressive in the sense very large proportion of his income is going to tax, right? So we've completely broken that link on who pays tax for what. And we have no specific taxes which are targeted towards public goods, which can only be done at a local level. So I feel like the remnants of socialism and central planning, the biggest flaw in that is the loss of fiscal federalism. We just completely killed that because it's not compatible with any kind of central planning model, right? So I have no sense of how we reintroduce that. We've done some constitutional amendments and all that stuff. But at some point, we eventually need to get to a very, very high degree of autonomy at the urban local body, Panchayati Raj, that level. There are so many great themes in the book. I mean, we've talked about Wixel and Olson. I mean, you guys talk about in such detail, not just social movements, but also political parties, what they mean, anti-defection. But instead of discussing those very important and serious themes, I feel like we should come to the Bollywood in the book because one is Raghu and I are crazy Bollywood buffs and Pranay is kind of there somewhere with us. But I think we both are like a little bit excessive. And Raghu, of course, is encyclopedic in his knowledge, especially niche bad Bollywood movies and also good Bollywood movies. Every chapter either begins with, a couplet or a dialogue or a Bollywood movie song, or, it's there somewhere in the subsections. It's definitely there in the narrative. So one is, other than just interest, what is this doing in the book? It's obviously a rhetorical device, but what does this tell us about India and Indian policy more broadly? That's my first question. The overwhelming presence of Bollywood in the book, just the way we have the overwhelming presence of state or something else.
I take that. It's a particular interest of mine. I think there are two ways of looking at this. One is, if I were to be sitting in my living room and talking to my friends, I would have spoken like this, by interspersing all these conversations with some, couplet or a Bollywood reference. That's because I like to believe that can hold somebody's attention only for that long. And, we have written the book in a manner of speaking as if we are talking to someone. It's very conversational in its approach and tone. And therefore, that sort of helps us. The second is, I'm a strong sort of popular culture, I don't know what's the right word. Savant seems to be too highbrow for, lowbrow popular culture. But I like my popular culture.
No, you are savant.
Yeah, I'm a savant. So, and I always believe that the way people who are producing popular culture, who are deeply steeped in it, they capture a certain thing about us, which, often the best of, theorists or, scholars sometimes do not. And that's very useful as a lens to see how that sort of, what is the shifting sand of, what is popular today and what was popular yesterday, what is turning out to be popular. Because, in some ways it's that old thing, politics is downstream of culture. Everything is downstream of culture because culture sort of catches a thing faster and then everything else, evolves from there. A few days back, I was just, don't ask me the reason why I was doing this. I was just trying to see what is the timeline of Pepsi ads in India and what were their slogans.
Yeah.
So this is a digression, but just to sort of make the point, and this point, you could write a paper on it, or you could just put 4 Pepsi ads to ask yourself what was happening in India over a period of time. So Pepsi comes, and then in early 90s, just about 91, 92, right after some initial reform in 92, they come out with the first ad. Now the first ad, this is like Pepsi really making its announcement. There was an ad for the ad, if you remember, in Doordarshan, ke bhi ad aayega. And the ad was a 45-second ad, which all of us had. It was like an event, I remember. And then, there was Remo Fernandez and there was Juhi. And then she turned and she throws her cap and she's like a Michael Jackson sort of a costume. And the ad starts by saying, "Are you ready for the magic?" Right? Are you ready for the magic? That was the ad. And this is like, it is almost like saying, "Boss, khul gaya." Dr. Singh has done things. Are you ready for the magic, right? And then from there, within 5 years, we moved to, Ye Dil Mange More.
Ye Dil Mange More.
And then actually from there, we moved to another one in 96, 97, which says, Yehi hai right choice, baby.
Yeah, right choice.
It is like a strengthening of the resolve that despite having Devegowda or I.K. Gujral, this is the right thing to do. Continue with it. And then in late 90s, early 2000, we go down Yahi Hai Right Choice Baby. And we, have that. And then in mid 2000, it is Oye Bubbly. This is like real, shining, India shining happening in 2004, 5 and stuff like that. And by 10 or 11, it is Hindustan ka wow. and that I was looking at, they have not got many memorable ones in the last 10 years, which sort of suggests that India's lost decade. Kya hai, theme kya hai, hamare country ka? We don't know. But if you just see over a 20-year period, it captures something. I mean, there is a progression when things were very much in go-go years of 2004-5. It is Oye Babdi, Hindustan Ka Wow, and then, it kind of fizzles out after that. And that Hindustan Ka Wow was, I think, 2010 or 11. Uske baad, nobody felt that there was a Hindustan Ka Wow. And, everything went down a particular path. And that's it. I mean, I can tell the story of the 20 years from 91 to 2011 through all kinds of framework, or I can, narrate it with decent theoretical framework by having these as milestones. I mean, it's up to, people to tell me which is the more memorable way of sort of, making the point. And none of these things happened by design. It's retrofitting a certain thing. But it is a good retrofit. And, sometimes things don't happen because somebody is planning it that way. Somebody is just capturing a certain essence of what is there in the air and putting it out there. And that's why it succeeds, because they are capturing that moment and people respond to that moment. And it's for some kind of pop culture historians to go back and say, well, there is something here which is sort of, putting a thread across all of this. I love doing that. And once you are in that mood, or you get into that frame, and a lot of things appear to you as, in some sense, a continuation of things, in some sense, a representation of something. And it's fun. And, even those people who actually write them, who create them, might not realize it. But it is for the jobs of people like us to sometimes, make this somewhat coherent and appealing to people who then read it and possibly make sense of it.
Most of the Bollywood thing is Raghu's work. And one angle that we always wanted to come up with is not write a public policy textbook. The idea is to write a book which will reach people who generally don't care about public policy or are, thinking of it at the margins. It's not their main aim. So it's not meant for academics, right? So the idea was, how do you make it more interesting? And our aim was to write a halki fulki par gehri book, right? A light yet deep book. So deep from at least introduce people to core concepts, but write it in a way which doesn't come across as being, very textbookish. So that's why these rhetorical devices sort of help. And the other interesting angle about all this is how many of these pop culture references get the problem definition right, but almost always get the solution wrong. There is, I guess, a lesson in that as well. And that again becomes a nice way to tell that, problem definition, that happens not just in pop culture references, in the way we talk and give causality to events as well, right? Problems are always right. The solutions are totally wacky. So that was the idea.
No, actually, I got that too. And I think I hit that realization when you're talking about Mohan Joshi Hazir Ho. I think that's where you mentioned that, Saeed Mirza got the problem of rent control and what goes on right, but he's got the villains all wrong in the book, right?
Completely.
So the reason that's when the Bollywood thing really struck me is, I don't know if you've read this. This is Deirdre McCloskey's Rhetoric of Economics. This is actually one of her famous works. And rhetoric almost has a bad or, not a serious framing, right? Because economics is a science, right? It's supposed to be scientific, right? And when we are scientific, then how can we use rhetoric? And basically, like McCloskey, like all things she does, I mean, this is counterintuitive, but it's just so skillfully written that the business we're in at the end of the day, though scientific, is persuasion, right? And for that, we have to bring the humans back in. So whatever is the appropriate persuasive device, right? In your case, it might be, particular kind of sort of mass-consumed Bollywood movies, at least most of them. And it could be something else. It could be stories, it could be legal cases, it could be song, folklore, whatever it might be. Like one of your colleagues, Nitin Pai, has written, lovely sort of public policy insights or economics insights sides, but written in the style of, old world, Hindu, Buddhist, Greek tales like Aesop's fables or Jataka tales or something like that. Right. So at the end of the day, the reason the McCloskey thing hit me, it's weird, is because of exactly what you said, which is we need to have some form of persuasion. And, the culture seems to have gotten the problem statement right. But economics at the end of the day is still a science, right? We have to understand first principles and that, where are we starting from? What are the incentives? What is the emergent order from those incentives? Like, we have rules. We have the law of demand, like the law of gravity. This is not just, something we made up. So that is, where I place the Bollywood in it. And the realization hit me when you have the rent control chapter. I don't know if there were other hidden messages that I might have missed.
McCloskey's work and then narrative economics, right? Schiller's work as well. That talks about, how important stories and narratives are to everything, and that we teach at Takshashila's public policy courses as well, that, narratives now has a very pejorative meaning. Political narratives people get, but the narratives are important in policy making as well, right? Unless you're able to tell a good story, you can present the best evidence and the great charts that you have, but unless you have a good story, no one's going to buy that. So I think it's important to understand narratives, to be able to, if nothing else, use it as a defense against the dark arts, like someone else is definitely using narrative. So maybe you need to at least be equipped to resist falling for a good narrative, if nothing else.
Yeah. So now let me ask you part 2 of the question, which is, why does Bollywood make for such great narrative and persuasion device? Is it simply because it's popular? So lots of people know it. So you're almost using it as a sort of, coordinating device. So we all know we're talking about the same thing, right? When you say Mogambo Khush Hua, or when you talk about one of the famous movie dialogues or movie songs from Andhi. Alternatively, is there something about Indian cinema, especially Hindi cinema, which manages to capture Indian society so perfectly and distill its essence that it works so well as a rhetorical device in the book?
Since I love it so much, and it's not just Bollywood or Hindi cinema, I love all Indian cinema. Yeah, and actually all cinema, but let's restrict ourselves to Indian cinema. I will tend to favor the second argument, that even in its, in the most pulpy, overwrought sort of, manifestation, it still captures something about us. And it's important for us to recognize that. Why did Jai Santoshi Ma become the number 1 hit of 1975? I have a reason for that. So there is something. Second part is that mostly, and I hope it continues, if you sit back at the end of a Hindi film and you look at the credits roll, just look at the names, everyone who's come together is absolutely, there is no other endeavor in India where the cross-section of society is so widely represented. Indian boardrooms are not representative of India. Yeah, Bollywood.
Maybe railways. That's the only other thing I can think of. But yeah.
But even there, the leadership might still be somewhat skewed.
Yeah.
But in Bollywood, when you look at that final list of people who've contributed to make that movie, it is, without anybody trying to, it is the most diverse. It is the most representative of what we have. And I think that should mean, and therefore it means, that whatever product comes out is one of those products that is as pure as you can get to what a typical Indian product is. People are trying to sort of, change that also. But you will find that if you try and not have it, you will fail in making a successful Bollywood product. At least so far, that experience has been very good. You might win in, 1 or 2 of them, but you try to think that you've sorted this out and you will have a certain kind of people make a certain kind of story because you think that's going to work. That doesn't work. So, I think both of these are important points. It's the most representative, has always been. And in some ways, because it is that, it captures everything. There is that Shah Rukh Khan, somewhat average grosser, called Fir Bhi Dil Hai Hindustani.
Oh, yeah.
It's an underrated film.
I think it's an underrated film, but that might be my love for Shah Rukh.
It's an underrated film. I completely agree with you. And firstly, that Fir Bhi Dil Hai Hindustani, this is a Shailendra line from Shri 420. It is such a line. Fir Bhi Dil Hai Hindustani. There is no equivalent of any other country saying that, despite all of this, my heart is Indian. Nobody would use that. It is, in some sense, there is a certain degree of saying that, I fully appreciate what kind of a country or what kind of a people we are. despite that, Dil Hai Hindustani, Shailendra caught it there. And that Shah Rukh movie has many different aspects, many of them ahead of its time. It's like the Truman Show, pulpy. And Javed Akhtar updates that song with Hindustani. I mean, you listen to those lines of Javed Akhtar, it is so accurate in, describing all our contradictions, yet in a manner that is quite joyous. So, yeah, therefore, to cut all of this short, I agree with your second thesis that Bollywood does capture something quintessential about us. So it's very difficult. No other medium captures it as well.
Do you think in 20 years we'll feel like Bollywood is not that medium, it's actually television, because a revolution took place and there was a TV in every single household, and Bollywood never quite managed the penetration beyond music, which of course has very, very wide penetration. But actually Bollywood movies are not seen by as many people anymore as television is. Whereas we didn't have that, right? From 50s to almost like mid-90s.
See, my worry on television is, it could come true. You are right. My worry about television is that television is very, very fragmented, and because of its, whatever long series and multiple episodes, etc., it can do many things. And therefore...
And it can drift.
And it can drift, and it can be niche. It can be in certain areas and not in other areas. It doesn't give you the full thali experience, which is a worry. So I'm hoping that it doesn't happen, because Bollywood gives 3 घंटे में पूरा thali, full smorgasbord, सब कुछ मिल जाता है.
I think I agree with you. And hopefully the movies also improve. We've had a bit of a drought for a while. So here's to also hoping for that. But thank you so much for doing this. This was so much fun. I hope this was fun for you. And it's always a pleasure talking to both of you.
Thank you.
This was great fun.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.